All right, I am back here on the podcast talking 30 for 30, Once Upon a Time in Queens. Very happy today to be joined by the director of the four-part documentary. Nick Davis is on the line. Nick, how are you?
I'm good, Mike. Thanks for having me.
No problem. I thank you for coming on because I got to say, I talked about this a couple of weeks ago with the co-editor of my website, John Coppinger. You were talking about it. We tagged you on Twitter, and you just had some fun talking to you about it and said this sort of happened now organically.
Yeah. I mean, it's been really fun. You make these things, and you spend a long time just with your own people and your own thoughts and team and stuff. So it's been really fun to get out there with it and talk to people and see what they're enjoying or not enjoying or missing, and try and answer questions about why things ended up the way they did.
Yeah, and obviously I want to start out here because obviously you're a big Met fan. You were around for that 86 team. What was your experience like with that team? Obviously that was before I was born, so I missed out on all that.
That was the greatest fan experience that I will ever have in my life. I was 12 in 1977. You can do the math. And from that low moment of June 15th, 1977, you just felt like, this is it. I mean, Seaver's gone. The franchise is in the toilet. As it happens, the city is in the toilet as well. And I don't know how we're ever going to get back from this. And so to watch over the years as that team was put together, piece by piece, it was just tremendously exciting. And by 84, it was, when it was really first sort of believed, it was just tremendously exciting. And I remember being at a game in August of 85, and Gooden was pitching against the Expos and he was mowing them down and the place, Shea Stadium, was rocking, and I had never experienced anything like this. And as a Met fan, as any fan, you wait for that team, that historically great team. In my case, I'd always read The Boys of Summer and thought, what would it be like to have been a fan of those great Brooklyn Dodger teams? And now all of a sudden it was happening. And I remember saying to myself in the stadium, remember this, it's not going to happen again. And, in fact, 84, 85, and then 86, the crowning moment, it was just unbelievably exciting. And so to be able to go back and tell that story was just an absolute thrill.
Yeah, for sure. And I always was curious about how this project got started, because I assume last year when it got announced in May of 2020, we assumed, it's just a reaction to The Last Dance. But I understand you've been working on this long before. So how'd you get involved with this project?
So I first, look, I've loved this team ever since it existed. And I was even in Hollywood in the 90s pitching a fictionalized version of the Goodfellas of baseball. Which was to be based on the 86 Mets. That never got off the ground. And then in about 2010, after 30 for 30 got going, I read about some long form documentary that was going to do the 86 Mets story. And I was so angry. And I just felt like, why did I not make this happen? And then I never heard anything about it. And in 2015, I started working on, my last film was a PBS American Masters about Ted Williams. And it was the first time in about 20 years I'd worked on anything having to do with baseball, but I loved it. I loved Ted Williams, or I came to love Ted Williams. And the whole time I was working on that, I was asking Major League Baseball, with whom I was partnering on that film, what happened to that 86 Mets project? Why hasn't it been done in the era of long form documentaries? And I was thinking more of the O.J. Simpson, O.J. Made in America, the Ezra Edelman film, which is terrific. Like, why not do something that does for that team, gives it the time and space? It's an epic story of a team and a time and a place. What happened to that? And, I don't know what happened to that particular project, but I was able to get Major League Baseball to say, all right, let's do this Ted Williams thing, then we'll talk about that. So in 2018, when the Williams film was finished, I got serious with Major League Baseball, had preliminary meetings with various networks who told me, well, in order to do it, here's what you would need to do. They gave me a long laundry list of things I needed to do, including, most crucially, they would say things like, no offense, Nick, but you need an 800-pound gorilla. And in my case, the 800-pound gorilla was Jimmy Kimmel, who, through a crazy set of circumstances, we were able to bring on board as an executive producer, so that by the time we were pitching networks in the fall of 2019, we had it all. We had the Mets participation, we had Major League Baseball, we had a really good written treatment, a pitch, and Jimmy Kimmel as the executive producer. So that's sort of the genesis of the project.
Yeah, I want to ask about the Mets involved specifically because I know this is a big part of their history. So what was the meeting like with the Mets when you went to them and said, hey, we want to do this big long form story about your 86 championship team? Were they on board right away? Did they have hesitations? What was the experience with the Mets like?
I think I got really lucky. I think there had been hesitations in the past. I think they're all the scandals and rapscallion-ish or nefarious, depending on how you feel about it, behavior was something the Mets didn't really want to touch for a long, long time. But they also recognized it's really important to the fan base and that story and that team. And if it was going to be done, they didn't want to try and whitewash it because we all knew the stories. So for whatever reason, and maybe it was because by the time I got there in the fall of 2019 or 2018 when I met with the Mets, the ownership change was brewing. I don't know, but there was nothing but, okay, this is the right team to do this. Let's do it. And with their participation, all it meant was they would say, Jay Horowitz would call a player and say, take this guy's phone call. Yeah. But that's huge. If Jay Horowitz is telling, Darryl Strawberry or Keith or whoever, pick up this guy's phone call, that means that the team wanted it to happen. But I was really lucky and the timing worked out in so many wonderful ways.
Yeah, for sure. I remember reading when this came out, you said on Twitter too, when you were live tweeting during the documentary, that the original vision of this story was you want to do a 7-part series and it got cut to 4. So was there any big stuff like the original vision? You said originally you wanted to do a whole episode on the 87 season, sort of the downfall of that team. So any other big elements got cut from the 6-hour plus version?
Well, so there's two different things. First, I went to Major League Baseball and I said, let's do this in 7 hours. And within about a day, they said, the market won't bear 7 hours. And so it was a market decision as much as anything else. But I think it was wise. I think 7 probably would have been too much. Then when I handed in the initial rough cut for the 4-hour version, which it's 4 commercial hours, so it's actually only 3 hours and 20 minutes or 21 minutes. They gave us an extra minute in episode 4. That was 6 hours and 25 minutes. And so much had to be cut, at that point to get it down to size. And, I don't think there was anything crucial. There were just lots of terrific stories and Lenny Dykstra telling the great story about going hunting with Kevin McReynolds, and Ray Knight telling a fantastic story about stopping Darryl Strawberry and Gary Carter from having a fight on a team bus. All kinds of just wonderful stories, but to service the complete story, the single story, nothing essential was lost. As a Met fan, and a Met fan with a particular bent, I do wish I'd been able to get deeper into the ownership story because the ownership story during the summer of 1986 was fascinating. But ultimately, I think I felt like it's distracting and it's confusing what happened between Wilpon and Doubleday that summer, and takes a lot of real estate that is probably better used for stories of the team itself.
Yeah, it makes sense. And obviously, this is a story everybody knows very well. It's been told a lot of different ways, a lot of different times. It's like an hour special, books, so on. How did you want to sit out and say, how to make my version different from what's already out there? What was your idea to try and separate yourself?
I never thought that way. I just felt like, you know what? It's never been done as a 4-hour documentary. Yes, Perlman's book is fantastic, and Darryl and Doc is a terrific documentary about the two of them and where they are now. But nobody had ever said, we're going to do the epic tale of New York City and how it fused and fell in love with this particular team in that time. And those players who embodied the city in a way that very few sports teams ever embody their city. And so I never was too concerned about, and I knew that the chatter was, we've heard this before. Well, no, you haven't. I mean, or maybe you've heard it or you've read it, but you haven't felt it in a documentary. You haven't lived it the way only a documentary film can. You may have read the books, you may have read the articles, but you haven't done this particular story this particular way. And so I wasn't overly concerned about all that, although I did know that, well, that's what people are going to say when it comes out. Like, oh no, not this again. And even the Mets, some of them had the feeling of like, why are we doing this again? But then I think very quickly, once we began, they all realized, oh, wait a minute, this actually hasn't been done before. No one has done a deep dive into this team in this way for this form, so yeah.
Yeah, I also noticed I'm glad you brought the city of New York itself, because I noticed that was the big thing that stuck out to me, was that you made an effort, I feel like, to make the city of New York itself like a character in the film, whether it was through like stories of the team going around the city, stuff going on in the city in the late 70s, early 80s. I think that definitely felt like added to the whole aspect of this film, made it feel like a more complete product, having New York itself be a character in it.
Well, you couldn't be here then and not get that feeling. It was not like a grafted on idea. It was, and it came also from the players themselves. They were all talking about how it was such an exciting time to be in New York, and that they would go out and would be treated in this incredible way. And the interviewees were all saying like the city and the team blended and they became one in a really, it doesn't happen often. And so it was sort of natural that this city and become, as you say, like almost like a character. It was so present. It's present in all the shots. It's the present in, one of my favorite shots in the film is that incredible documentary shot of the tracking shot of Mookie Wilson leaving the field and after the ground ball that went through the first baseman's legs, and he's leaving the field and the cameraman is just tracking behind him, and he's going into the dugout and the fans are going crazy and the policemen are there clapping him on the back, and like that feeling of like being so embraced and embedded in the city was just, it was sort of everywhere we looked. We interviewed Kurt Anderson, who doesn't know anything about baseball. I mean, he freely admitted when I first contacted him, he said, I can talk about the 80s, but I in New York City, I can't talk about the Mets. I was hardly paying attention. I was putting on a magazine. And I said, well, that's fine. Maybe we won't use it. And everything he said about the city was true of the Mets. So it was just a natural thing as we were making the film that it sort of told us, when you're making a film, it can tell you what it is. And the film told us what it was.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned that Mookie Wilson like tracking shot where the cameraman follows into the dugout. Like obviously that's one I'd never seen before. I'm sure you had a lot of interesting sources of footage that didn't really get circulated widely publicly. I know you mentioned on Twitter that the 86 team apparently had a documentary crew following them around, and I find it crazy that like they had all that and that never really got out in some big project before this.
Yeah, I mean, lots of it, or not lots of it, but they did use, some of it in the 86 Mets Year in Review, which is this terrific film that every, Met fan got that winter for Christmas, A Year to Remember. But, they only had an hour and they were telling the whole season's story. They didn't go into the city. And they didn't use as much of it as we were able to, because we had more time.
Yeah, that's true. And I also loved like getting behind the scenes inside some of like the ridiculous rap videos they were doing as a team, whether it was the Get Mets Mirage or Let's Go Mets Go. Like it definitely was fun seeing behind the scenes some of that. Part of me just wishes you could have found Joe Piscopo, get his commentary getting tackled in the dugout, but that would have been funny.
Yes. Yeah. I think if we'd had a larger budget and maybe the 6-hour or 7-hour version, we would have gone after Joe Piscopo.
Yeah. And in terms of the interviews, I know the one interview you mentioned that was actually like alluded to in the documentary you tried to get but couldn't get was George Foster. You said a little bit on Twitter about why that didn't happen. Can you talk a little bit about the George Foster experience? What was like trying to get him for the interview?
Yeah. So, I mean, the process was with most of these guys, Jay Horowitz would make the initial contact and then he would say, okay, here's the number, call him. And in George Foster's case, he said, George Foster doesn't want to participate. And I said, well, can I just talk to him? And Jay said, sure. So well, he said, check with George. And so I had a conversation with George Foster, and this was, I think, pre-pandemic. And it was great. It was hilarious. He's a very fun and smart man. And I was able to, I thought, convince him, look, you were there. You were a part of the story. It didn't end well. It didn't begin particularly well, but you were an important cog in that machine. You were the first great acquisition of the Frank Cashin era. It was like a shot across the bow of the rest of baseball. Hey, the Mets mean business now. We're getting a former MVP, and we just want to hear your thoughts. And he said, okay, and he would do it. And then the pandemic hit, and it knocked us out for a couple of months, and we sort of had to gather our, forces to figure out, well, how are we going to do this? And we figured out how we were going to do it, film the interviews remotely. So I called George back or texted him and said, hey, we want to figure this out. Here's how we're doing it. We're going to hire a local crew in Cincinnati and come to you. And at that point, he said, I'm going to politely decline. So he may have had second thoughts anyway, but it was another thing that, had me upset with the pandemic. On the other hand, I do think that we tell his story and that part of the story as well as it can be told. And some guys are not great advocates for themselves. So maybe it's even better that he didn't participate. I feel like I'm not sorry for the film's sake that we didn't get him. I'm sorry for my sake that we didn't get him.
Yeah, I also thought it was great. You mentioned that you tell his story, he's not there. The one thing I didn't know is that he was there in Game 6 of the '86 World Series, and my partner John Coppinger made out. It's like that he was there for the NBC, and so they're coming back. They're gonna win this game. I thought it was fascinating piece of interview you got from, I think it was Ann Ligori said that, or
yeah, Ann Ligori said that, and that was an amazing bit of information. And when we found that out from in a pre-interview with Ann Ligori, we said we have to talk to you because what was he doing there? She didn't know why he was there. I would have loved to have asked him, like, what were you doing? And it was probably some, corporate engagement or something. But the fact that he's the one in the film who says, you can't count this team out. And even when he's being released, he says he's sad because he won't be with this team when they win the World Series. They all had that mindset that they were going to win no matter what. It's so rare. You don't see a team that has that, obviously all teams, expect to win, but the real almost knowledge that they were going to win. And then the fact that they very nearly didn't, it just incredible.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously you couldn't get him, but you'd tell his story. Is there anybody else that you felt like you wanted from that team you couldn't get? Like you tried to reach out to, you didn't find?
Not really. I mean, there was a couple other guys we just didn't connect with in time, or one other player said no, and it was early in the process. And my sense was, he doesn't understand what we're doing. He thinks it's just going to be another rehash of the negativity and sort of all about Darryl and Doc. But really, no, I felt like we got most of the major players and a representative sampling of those who were not as important. We had these sort of two outsidery figures on the team, one who was traded before '86, Billy Beane, and one who was traded in the middle of the year, Ed Lynch. And they were almost like a fish out of water. If things had been different, that's me. If I had been a baseball player, Ed Lynch, I can understand that guy. He's normal and human, and he can tell the story of these crazy, outrageous athletes. And same with Billy Beane. So I feel like we covered the waterfront pretty well.
Yeah, and I also saw, I was curious, obviously Terry Pendleton was in there, and we know the role he plays in '87, basically ending that team season. He was really the most notable, opposing player in the doc who had no ties to the Mets itself. Did you consider more guys like him, or was he sort of okay, he's our guy for that role in the film?
Yeah, he again, there were a few other players we approached, and I'm not making excuses. I'm very proud of the film, and winding up with the 44 interviewees that we did have was great. We would have had more if it hadn't been for the pandemic. We actually, the other guy who said no was Mike Scott. It would have been fun to talk to him. But again, I think the film works great for his not being in there, and to hear the great Jeff Pearlman story about, one of these days I will write my book and I'll tell the truth about scuffing. Oh, great. When are you going to write your book? Never. So I feel like that, that's all you really need to hear from Mike Scott. But it would have been fun to talk to him anyway.
Yeah.
But he said no. Yeah.
Yeah, I did love the part, though, when you told Mike Scott's story when you had, I forget which player it was showed you the scuffed baseballs. I got about 15 of these in my basement, so I thought that was a fun way to show, he's still scuffing the balls.
Yeah. No, Ed Hearn kept all these baseballs for 35 years. Ed Hearn has kept these scuffed baseballs. It's hilarious, and it's lore, and it's like myth making, and that's what makes this team so fun, is like they were so larger than life. And whatever team wins the World Series this year, I'm sure it's going to be a great team, and somebody could do a documentary about them. But they don't, they're not like these mythic figures almost the way the '86 Mets were.
Yeah, and I want to talk about like a couple of the civic interviews you got, and I'd start with Lenny Dykstra, because obviously, like, we've heard all the stories about Lenny's issues off the field, all the crazy stuff he did on the field, but I have to say, like, the experience of interviewing him, I mean, he comes off as one of the most interesting people in this film, because, like, as my partner said on the site, like, he has to come off like a crazy old uncle, like, where he's just saying all these, like, wacky stories. So what was it like talking to Lenny for this project?
It was great. And that was one of the real highlights, I have to say, was interviewing Lenny. It was the first of I think it was the first of the remote interviews that we did. So I was here in New York in my office, and he was in LA. We rented a place to film him in, and had a, producer on set, an LA-based producer, LA-based cameraman, everyone masked, and the Lenny Wrangler got him to the set on time, and he's being interviewed. I'm conducting the interview from my office over Zoom. They placed the laptop right next to the camera, so he's looking just off camera as he would as if I were in the room. And it was, 4 hours of just amazing, stories and profanity and hilarious stuff, but also I found very moving at times, very kind of honest. He's obviously had a challenging, difficult life, and, he doesn't make excuses for it, but he's out there. And, a number of people, when I was finished, they were like, well, was he crazy? And I was like, no, I don't think he's crazy. I think he's crazy like a fox. I think he knows what he's giving out. He knows that he's, to some extent, playing the role of Nails, and that we expect a certain kind of nuttiness from him and unfilteredness. But he's also honest and talks about, like, at the end of the film, like the thing about, his life now, and days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, months turn into years, but it's okay, because I won a World Series in New York City. Where do you go from there? It's like, I was very moved by that in the interview room, or in the interview Zoom, and I was really happy to put it in the film.
Yeah, the other interview I want to get to also is Keith Hernandez. Obviously, I think he comes off as sort of like the main character of the '86 Mets here, where he was obviously their captain, the leader of the team. And I think the most fascinating thing about his interviews, obviously besides the presence of Haji, which is always great, but the home movies, like, what part of the point did Keith volunteer to show you the home movie? Did you know about these things? What happened with the home movies?
No, I can't remember. Maybe he wrote about it in his book. He must have written about the home movies in his book, and I asked him about it, and he said, yeah, sure, I'm happy to give them to you and put them on DVD and get them back to me. Nobody had ever seen them before, and they're incredible. That, the father was so involved in Keith's baseball career that he had the mom take, 8mm film, which it's not like, it's on your phone. Like, you have to go buy an 8mm camera, and, it's complicated if you're not someone who's good at gadgets. And so it was just kind of amazing. And then at key moments in his life, Keith's father would say, look at this, I want to show you this. And he would say, look, there you were 11 years old, and I knew you had it. And this is why I was so hard on you, because I knew you had a chance to be something special, and I wasn't going to let you blow it. And it's just like, that's very intense. And I was thrilled and so delighted and really, it was just amazed that Keith was so willing to talk about what he went through in his childhood with his dad. And same thing with all the guys. I mean, certainly Doc and Daryl, most particularly, that they talked about their childhood so openly was really a gift to the film.
Yeah, for sure. And my last question here is just sort of, obviously, we got a lot of stories we never heard before. I know I can think of a bunch on top of my head, whether it was Bob O'Hea's secret injection, like shot before he starts in the NLCS, Gary Carter fighting Lenny Dykstra in the hotel, them ordering a hooker for Jay Horwitz in Montreal, them wrecking the plane. Like what story when you found out and you said, "Oh my God, this is gold. I have to get this in here." What was like that one story that jumped out to you right away?
Well, I tell you, the mule kicking story I loved so much. Yeah. And the hotel, and Dykstra said it was in Atlanta, where he was mule kicking Gary Carter's door, trying to get him to come out at 3:00 in the morning. And then Carter, I mean, it was, obviously a great tragedy that Carter, and ironic that Carter would be the one to go first, and that his voice, I mean, we have his voice and we have his widow, Sandy Carter, who was terrific in the film and terrific and open with us. But he's portrayed so often as just like a big goofy guy. But that story is so great because it shows how tough he was too. And you didn't mess with Gary Carter. And, Lenny Dykstra, ha ha ha, it's all very funny and cute. But, gosh darn it, let me get my sleep and don't you ever do this again. So I think that when Lenny told that story, I was like, well, this is going right in. And I was very happy about that. And I should say that, the 6.5 hour version, which I thought we were done. I knew we weren't done, but I loved every minute of it. One of the great things is we do have this book, and the book is an oral history and is essentially transcripts from the interviews that we did. And the book is, now available at bookstores and everything. And it contains a lot of the stories that we didn't have time for. So everything that was in that 6.5 hour rough cut pretty much is in the book, and other stories as well. So a lot of the things that, just in talking to you, I've thought of a couple of other things. I was like, I wish we'd had time for, the fact that Terry Pendleton's home run, in '87, which knocked the Mets essentially out of contention and ruined the chance of them repeating as champions. His home run sailed over the center field wall and dented Ron Darling's Mercedes, and we didn't have time for that in the film, but that was just such a great detail, and that's in the book, and that's what I'm very happy to like, that we have the book to sort of catch all the stuff that we didn't have time for in the film.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely plan on getting that book because I would definitely want to see all those stories that did not make the cut. I'm fascinated by that. And are any of the projects you're working on right now, you want to let the audience know what some stuff to look for in the future from you?
Well, the craziest coincidence in my life is that I have been working on a book for the last, another book for the last 18 or 19 years about my family. My grandfather was Herman Mankiewicz, who people may know because he wrote Citizen Kane with Orson Welles. And my great uncle was Joe Mankiewicz, who wrote and directed, among other movies, All About Eve and Cleopatra and a bunch of other things. And so I wrote a book about them that came out the same day that the documentary aired, just a total coincidence. And that book is called Competing with Idiots, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, A Dual Portrait. So that's the other thing that I have out now. And then I've got other films that are coming, but too early to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. Let me keep an eye on the future. If you want to follow you on Twitter, it's at Nick Davis Prods, correct?
I think so. I'm not great on the Twitter. I'm trying. But yes, I think it's Nick Davis Prods. Yeah.
For sure. So follow Nick there. Be sure to check out his books if you enjoyed this interview. Nick, thanks for all the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. It was a pleasure. Take care.